In 1880, if you stood in a train station in Pittsburgh, there were 6 different clocks on the wall. Each one showed a different time. Each one was correct. That's because every city in America set its own time. Pittsburgh time was different from Philadelphia time, which was different from New York time. By 5 minutes here, 8 minutes there. There were over 300 separate time zones in the United States, and nobody thought that was strange until the railroads made it deadly. Today, you glance at your phone and see the time. You assume that time is the same for everyone in your state, your region, your time zone. You assume it has always been this way. It hasn't. For most of American history, time was local. Time was personal. Time belonged to your town and your town alone. And the story of how that changed, how America went from 300 different times to 4, is a story about power, about who gets to decide something as fundamental as what hour it is, and about a single day in November 1883, when the railroads told the United States government to sit down and shut up. Because Congress didn't create your time zone. The railroad companies did. And they didn't ask permission. Let me take you back to a world where noon meant something completely different than it does today. For thousands of years, humans told time by the sun. This wasn't primitive, this was accurate. When the sun reached its highest point in the sky, that was noon. Solar noon. The moment when shadows were shortest. The moment when the sun was directly over your head. Every civilization figured this out independently. The Egyptians knew it, the Greeks knew it. The Romans knew it. The Chinese knew it. If you wanted to know when it was noon, you didn't need a clock. You needed eyes. You looked up. And here's the thing about solar noon. It happens at a slightly different moment depending on where you're standing on the Earth. If you're in Philadelphia and your friend is in Pittsburgh, about 300 miles west, the sun reaches its highest point over Pittsburgh roughly 16 minutes after it reaches its highest point over Philadelphia. That's not an error. That's geometry. That's the Earth rotating on its axis. 15 degrees of longitude per hour, which means every 70 miles or so, solar noon shifts by about 1 minute. So Philadelphia noon was not Pittsburgh noon. And Pittsburgh noon was not Cleveland noon. And Cleveland noon was not Chicago noon. And Chicago noon was not Denver noon. In every single town, every single village, every single crossroads in America had its own unique noon, determined by its exact position on the spinning Earth. In towns across the country, the process was the same. Someone with a good eye and a reliable watch would track the sun. When it peaked, when the shadows stopped shrinking and started growing again, that person would call out the time or ring a bell. The church might adjust its clock. The jeweler downtown would set his display, and everyone in town would synchronize to that moment. The church bells rang at noon. The factory whistles blew at noon. But noon in Boston was 11 minutes ahead of noon in New York. Noon in New York was 5 minutes ahead of noon in Philadelphia. Noon in Chicago was 50 minutes behind noon in Washington, D.C. This seems crazy to us now. We've grown up in a world of synchronized time, of atomic clocks and network signals that keep every device in perfect agreement. The idea that your neighbor 1 county over might be living 8 minutes in your future or your past feels absurd. But think about it from their perspective. If you've never traveled more than a day's ride from where you were born, if the fastest thing you've ever ridden is a horse, why would you care what time it is in the next town? Their noon and your noon never need to agree. You'll never be in both places at once. Their time is their business, and your time is yours. This wasn't chaos. This was reality. This was how time had worked since humans first started measuring it. For thousands of years across every continent, time was local because the sun was local. Your relationship with the sky was your relationship with time. And for most of history, it genuinely didn't matter. If you lived your whole life in one town, if you rarely traveled more than 20 miles from where you were born, why would you care that the next county over was 8 minutes behind you? You'd never know. You'd never notice. Your time was your time, and their time was their time, and the two rarely intersected. Think about what travel meant in 1820. If you wanted to go from New York to Chicago, you were looking at 3 weeks of hard travel, maybe more, by horseback through rough terrain, by stagecoach along rutted roads, by riverboat where the river's allowed. You weren't racing the clock. You weren't coordinating arrivals down to the minute. You left when you left. You arrived when you arrived. And along the way, you probably reset your pocket watch a dozen times to match whatever town you were passing through. Time was a local matter, like a local accent or a local dialect or a local custom. Philadelphia had Philadelphia time. Boston had Boston time. Baltimore had Baltimore time. And nobody in Washington was going to tell any of them what hour it was. By 1850, there were at least 80 different local times in just the Midwest alone. Wisconsin had 38 separate time standards within its borders. Think about that. One state, 38 different versions of right now. Ohio had 27 distinct times. Indiana, which to this day still confuses visitors with its time zone complications, had over 20 different local times. If you traveled across Indiana from east to west, you might pass through 7 or 8 different nows in a single day's journey. Your watch would be wrong at every stop, and nobody thought this was a problem. The people liked it that way. There's something important to understand here. Local time wasn't just practical. It was symbolic. It was political. It was about independence, about self-governance, about the right of free American communities to conduct their own affairs without interference from distant authorities. The idea that some bureaucrat in Washington or some executive in New York could reach into your town and tell you when noon was? That felt like an overreach. That felt like tyranny. Your town's time was your town's business. The church set the bells, the town council approved the time, the local jeweler synchronized the public clocks. This was community time. Democratic time, grassroots time. The sun belongs to everyone, and every community had the right to read it for themselves. So when did this beautiful, chaotic, hyper-local system become a problem? The answer is simple: speed. When the fastest thing on Earth was a horse, time differences between towns didn't matter. A 5-minute discrepancy between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia had no practical consequence because nobody could travel between them fast enough for 5 minutes to matter. But starting in the 1830s, something new began stretching across the American landscape. Iron rails, steam engines, machines that breathed fire and smoke, machines that could cover in 1 hour what used to take a full day. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central, names that would dominate American commerce for generations. And suddenly, those 5-minute differences between towns became deadly. Subscribe now if you want to understand exactly how. The first American railroads were short, 10 miles, maybe 20, local lines connecting a port to a factory, a mine to a mill, a town to its neighbor, and they ran on local time. Whatever time the town used, the railroad used. Simple enough. But railroads don't like to stay local. They want to grow. They want to connect. And by the 1850s, railroad companies were building lines that stretched hundreds of miles, passing through dozens of towns, each with its own clock, its own noon, its own version of reality. Now imagine you're a railroad dispatcher in 1855. Picture the job. You're sitting in an office with telegraph wires coming in from a dozen directions. You need to schedule trains running from Buffalo to Cleveland. That's about 200 miles of track, and for most of that route, you've got one track. One set of rails, trains going both directions. Buffalo runs on Buffalo time. Erie runs on Erie time. Ashtabula runs on Ashtabula time. Cleveland runs on Cleveland time. The difference between Buffalo and Cleveland is about 40 minutes. But there are at least 8 different local times along that route, each one a few minutes different from the last. So when you publish a schedule, whose time do you use? If a train leaves Buffalo at 8 a.m., Buffalo time, what time does it arrive in Cleveland? Cleveland time? Buffalo time? Some combination? And when 2 trains are supposed to pass each other at a siding near Erie, what time should each one arrive? Erie time? Or the time of whichever city they departed from? Here's what the railroads did, and God help anyone who had to make sense of it. Each railroad company picked its own time, called it railroad time. The New York Central ran on New York City time, which made sense since that's where their headquarters sat. The Pennsylvania Railroad ran on Philadelphia time. The Baltimore and Ohio ran on Baltimore time. Smaller regional lines ran on whatever time their headquarters used, which might be some small city you've never heard of. By 1880, there were at least 53 different railroad times in operation across the country. Not local times, railroad times. A separate layer of time confusion stacked on top of the 300 local times already in existence. Picture what this meant for passengers. A traveler changing trains in Pittsburgh might walk into the station and find one clock showing 12 o'clock, another showing 12:15, a third showing 12:25, a fourth showing 11:50, and the city's own clock showing 12:08, all at the same moment, all technically correct according to their respective authorities. Railroad stations started installing multiple clocks, not out of generosity, out of necessity. One clock for each major railroad that stopped there. The station in Buffalo had 3. The station in Pittsburgh had 6. Major junction stations in places like Indianapolis or Chicago might have a dozen different clocks lining the walls, all showing different times, said all labeled with different railroad company names. Conductors carried multiple pocket watches. Serious conductors, the ones who wanted to keep their passengers alive, might carry 3 or 4, each set to a different railroad's time. Passengers who traveled frequently learned to carry conversion tables, pocket cards that showed the offset between various railroad times and local times. Newspapers published columns explaining how to translate between times. The Pittsburgh Gazette might run a daily feature showing the current offset between Pittsburgh local time, Pennsylvania railroad time, and 3 or 4 other regional railroad times. Travelers needed these charts the way modern travelers need currency converters. And still, despite all these precautions, despite the multiple clocks and pocket watches and conversion tables, us people died. October 5th, 1841. A passenger train and a freight train collided head-on near Westfield, Massachusetts. Both engineers had followed their schedules correctly. Both had checked their watches. Both had the right time according to their clocks. Their clocks just happened to be set to different times. The collision killed 2 people instantly and injured more than 20 others. August 12, 1853. 2 trains met on a single track near Valley Falls, Rhode Island. Head-on collision at full speed. 13 people killed, more than 40 injured, families destroyed in an instant. The investigation found that the schedules had been printed using one railroad's time standard, but the conductors had been using watches set to another railroad's time. The difference was only about 15 minutes. 15 minutes of disagreement between 2 clocks killed 13 people. July 17, 1856, the Camp Hill collision outside Philadelphia. 2 trains on the same track, approaching each other. Neither engineer knew the other was there until too late. 67 people killed, including many children on a Sunday school excursion. The deadliest railroad accident in American history up to that point. December 30th, 1876, the Ashtabula River Railroad disaster in Ohio. A passenger train crossing a bridge during a blizzard. The bridge collapsed. The train plunged 70 feet into the frozen ravine below. Fire broke out in the wreckage from the kerosene heating stoves in each car. The wooden coaches became funeral pyres. 92 people died, many of them burned beyond recognition. Families received boxes of remains they couldn't identify. It was the worst railroad disaster in American history to that date. The investigation pointed to many factors, but scheduling coordination and timing between divisions came under scrutiny once again. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were symptoms of a system that had grown beyond its ability to coordinate itself. Every few months, somewhere in America, trains met where they shouldn't have met, and people who woke up that morning with full lives ahead of them were dead before lunch. The newspapers covered these disasters extensively. Illustrations of the wreckage, lists of the dead, interviews with weeping families, and always, buried somewhere in the coverage, questions about scheduling, about timing, about how 2 trains could both be on time and still collide. Throughout the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, railroad collisions happened with horrifying regularity, and time confusion was frequently cited as a contributing factor, not always the only cause. Signal failures happened, mechanical breakdowns happened, human errors of every kind happened. But time was the thread that ran through case after case, report after report. How could two engineers, both following the rules, both checking their watches, both absolutely confident they were safe, end up meeting at full speed on the same track? Because time itself had become unreliable. There was no single truth about what moment it was. A train that left on time by one measure was early by another and late by a third. An engineer who thought he had 5 minutes of clearance might actually have none, because his 5 minutes was someone else's 0 minutes. And nobody's clock agreed with anybody else's. The railroads knew it. They'd known it for decades. The major companies had tried voluntary coordination. They'd signed agreements. They'd published unified schedules. They'd held conferences and conventions and earnest discussions about the time problem. Nothing worked. Because no city wanted to surrender its time to another city. No railroad wanted to adopt a competitor's time and seem subordinate. And the federal government had no interest in stepping into what seemed like a commercial dispute. So the chaos continued, the collisions continued, and the body count continued to rise. If you're finding this valuable, take a second to hit subscribe. This is the kind of history that actually matters. By the 1870s, the largest railroad companies in America were desperate for a real solution. The scheduling nightmares were getting worse as the networks grew larger. The collision risks increased with every mile of new track. Customer complaints about confusing, incomprehensible timetables threatened to undermine public confidence in rail travel itself. Enter William Frederick Allen. Allen was editor of the Official Guide of the Railways, a thick publication that attempted to list every train schedule in North America. Attempted being the key word. Because how do you create a unified guide when every railroad runs on its own time, every city runs on its own time, and no two clocks in the entire country necessarily agree with each other? Allen had spent years wrestling with this impossible problem. He developed conversion tables, footnote systems, elaborate cross-reference schemes. None of it was satisfactory. The complexity was inherent to the system. The time system itself was broken. By 1881, Allen had developed a radical proposal. Forget local time completely. Forget railroad time. Create something entirely new. Divide the entire continental United States into 4 vertical strips, roughly equal in width. Within each strip, everyone would use exactly the same time, not solar time adjusted to local position. Not a patchwork of company standards. One single time for everyone in that zone. The boundaries would run along the 75th, 95th, 105th, and 120th meridians. Everything between the 75th and 95th would be Central Time. Everything between the 90th and 105th would be Mountain Time, and so on. Within each zone, no more 5-minute differences between neighboring towns. No more 16-minute differences between neighboring states. Everyone, from the eastern edge of the zone to the western edge, hundreds of miles apart, would look at their clocks and see the exact same number at the exact same instant. This was revolutionary, and from many perspectives, it was outrageous. Allen was proposing that the city of Detroit, which had proudly kept Detroit time for its entire existence, which had set its clocks by the actual sun overhead for generations, should suddenly declare that it was the same time in Detroit as it was in Pittsburgh, even though anyone with eyes could see that the sun was not in the same position. He was proposing that the good citizens of Chicago should look at their clocks at noon and see 12 o'clock, even though solar noon in Chicago happens roughly 27 minutes after solar noon on the Central Time Meridian. He was proposing, in essence, that Americans agree to lie to themselves about what time it was, to prioritize coordination over accuracy, to let a grid drawn on a map override the evidence of their own senses. Allen presented his plan to the railroad executives at the General Time Convention. They loved it. Of course they did. Unified time meant unified schedules. Unified schedules meant fewer collisions, fewer complaints, fewer lawsuits, more efficiency, more profit. But here's the part of the story that most people never learn. The railroads didn't ask Congress for permission. They didn't petition state legislatures. They didn't request approval from governors or mayors. They didn't hold public hearings or citizen consultations or anything resembling a democratic process. They just did it. On October 11th, 1883, the General Time Convention, representing the major American and Canadian railroad companies, voted unanimously to adopt William Allen's Standard Time proposal. They set the implementation date for November 18th, 1883, 5 weeks. They gave America 5 weeks to abandon 300 years of timekeeping tradition. And on that day, November 18th, 1883, something happened that had never happened before in all of human history. The clocks lied together, everywhere, all at once. The newspapers called it the Day of Two Noons. At noon, Eastern Standard Time, telegraph operators in observatories and railroad offices across the country sent out the new signal. Noon. Exactly noon. Right now. In cities like Boston, where solar noon roughly coincided with the new Eastern Standard Time, the adjustment was minor. The clocks might jump by a minute or two. The church bells rang. The sun was overhead. Life continued. But in cities further west within the eastern zone, at noon by railroad standard, the sun was still climbing. It hadn't reached its peak yet. It wouldn't reach its peak for another 10, 15, 20 minutes. And yet the clocks said noon. In places where local time had been significantly ahead of the new standard time, people experienced two noons. First at local solar noon, when the sun reached its actual peak and the church bells rang out of tradition. Then again, minutes later, when the railroad clock struck 12 and the new official noon arrived. The Chicago Tribune reported that the city experienced two noons about 9 minutes apart. At 11:51 a.m. Chicago Solar Time, which was now called 12 noon Central Standard Time, the railroad clock struck. But the sun didn't reach its zenith over Chicago until approximately 12:08 by the new standard. People stood in the streets looking between the clocks and the sky. Which noon was real? Which noon would they teach their children was correct? Were they now living by a lie? In cities that lost time, clocks jumped backward. At what had been 12 o'clock by local reckoning, the time suddenly became 11:43 or 11:47. A few minutes of the day simply vanished. Those minutes had existed 1 second, and then they didn't. People who had appointments at 11:45 suddenly found themselves late for something that hadn't happened yet. Workers arriving at factories found themselves either early or late, depending on which clock they'd followed. School bells rang at times that contradicted the sun. Church services began when the light said morning, but the clock said noon. Merchants stood in their shops, looking at the new time and wondering if their customers would show up at the old time or the new. Some posted signs explaining both. Some gave up and closed for the day entirely rather than deal with the confusion. Letters written that day bear witness to the strangeness. People wrote to family members trying to explain what had happened. "We lost 4 minutes today," one woman wrote to her sister. "They just took them. No one knows where they went." It's hard for us to imagine the disorientation. We've never experienced time itself becoming negotiable. But in November 1883, millions of Americans watched their clocks contradict reality, watched the official time disagree with the sun, and had to decide which authority to follow. Time itself seemed to stutter, to contradict what everyone could plainly see when they looked at the sky. And not everyone went quietly. The city of Detroit refused to adopt Central Standard Time. The city council held an emergency meeting and voted to keep Detroit time, which was 28 minutes ahead of the new Central Standard. They argued that railroad companies had no legal authority to tell a sovereign American city what time it was. Detroit held out for 17 years of stubborn, proud defiance. Think about what that meant in practice. The train station ran on Central Time. The factories that shipped by rail ran on Central Time, but City Hall ran on Detroit time. The courts ran on Detroit time. The schools ran on Detroit time. If you had a court appearance at 10 a.m., you showed up at 10 Detroit time. But if you were taking the train to get there, the train schedule was in Central Time, 28 minutes behind. Miss that calculation, and you missed your case. Businesses kept 2 sets of clocks, one for local customers, one for railroad dealings. Every appointment required clarification. Is that railroad time or real time? Became a common question in Detroit for nearly 2 decades. The confusion was constant, the inconvenience substantial, but the principle mattered. Detroit was making a statement. We are a free American city, and we will set our own clocks. They didn't adopt Central Time until 1900, and even then, there were protests. The vote was controversial. Old-timers remembered what they called God's time and resented its surrender. The newspapers printed letters from citizens mourning what Detroit had given up. Pittsburgh's City Council passed a resolution condemning the railroad's arrogance. Who gave these corporations authority to redefine noon? Augusta, Georgia refused for years. Cincinnati held out. Indianapolis debated fiercely. In Kentucky, a group of citizens filed a lawsuit arguing standard time was unconstitutional. They argued that the federal government had no enumerated power to regulate time, and if the government couldn't do it, private corporations certainly couldn't. The case was dismissed, but the sentiment was genuine. Religious groups objected on theological grounds. The sun was God's clock. Solar noon was sacred noon. These railroad men were playing at being gods, redefining creation itself to suit their schedules. Preachers gave sermons about the arrogance of man. They quoted scripture about the sun standing still for Joshua, about the sundial of Ahaz, about the heavenly bodies set in motion by the Creator to mark the days and seasons. And now, some railroad executive in Philadelphia thought he knew better than the Almighty when noon should be? In rural churches across America, ministers faced a dilemma. Should the noon prayer happen at railroad noon or at God's noon? Some split the difference. Some ignored the new standard entirely. Some reluctantly adopted it, sensing which way history was moving. Farmers objected on practical grounds. Cows didn't care what railroad clocks said. A cow's udder filled on its own schedule, and if you didn't milk her when she needed milking, you'd have problems no train schedule could solve. Crops didn't ripen according to Eastern Standard Time. The rhythms of agricultural life had followed the sun since the first seeds were planted. A farmer rising before dawn didn't look at a clock. He looked at the sky, light enough to work. Then it was time to work. Dark? Time to stop. What did it matter what the clock said? The rooster crowed when the rooster crowed, not when some railroad said he should. For decades after 1883, rural America lived in a kind of time duality. The trains came through on standard time. The mail arrived on standard time. But the actual work of farming happened on sun time, the way it always had. Old farmers taught their grandchildren to read the shadows, even as those grandchildren learned to read railroad clocks in school. But here's what happened in practice. The trains ran on the new time. Every single major railroad adopted standard time on November 18th, or in 1883. If you wanted to catch a train, you showed up on railroad time. Period. The telegraph offices ran on the new time. The banks ran on the new time. Within months, most organized resistance collapsed, not because people agreed with standard time, not because they thought it was right or fair or democratic, but because the railroads controlled the arteries of American commerce. And if you wanted to participate in modern economic life, you had to accept the rules of the people who controlled that infrastructure. The cities that held out found themselves increasingly isolated. Their businesses struggled to coordinate with partners elsewhere. Their residents missed trains. One by one, they gave in, not through persuasion, through exhaustion. This is a pattern worth recognizing. Subscribe now if you want to understand how power actually works. Let me be clear about what happened on November 18th, 1883. A group of private corporations acting without any legal authority whatsoever fundamentally altered how millions of Americans experience time. They didn't ask permission from Congress. They didn't consult the states. They announced it in October and implemented it in November. And the government did nothing. Congress could have intervened. They could have passed a law establishing an official federal time standard. They did nothing. For 35 years, America ran on unofficial time. The railroad's time. Corporate time. Time that had no basis in federal law. Courts used railroad time. Government offices used railroad time. Military bases used railroad time. all governed by a timekeeping system that existed purely because private industry said it should exist. It wasn't until March 19th, 1918, that Congress finally passed the Standard Time Act, and even then, the law was primarily about implementing wartime daylight saving. The time zones themselves were almost an afterthought, a rubber stamp on something that had been running for 35 years. Think about what that 35-year gap means. For 35 years, the official time in America existed in a legal gray zone. Courts scheduled cases by it. Contracts specified it. Banks opened and closed by it. The entire commercial infrastructure of the nation ran by a clock system that no legislature had ever approved. Presidents came and went. Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson. 6 presidents governed a nation whose timekeeping system had no legal basis whatsoever. The Constitution says nothing about time. It doesn't grant Congress the power to regulate clocks. It doesn't give the executive the authority to define noon. And so nobody did. The railroads stepped into that vacuum, and nobody stepped up to challenge them. There were efforts, occasionally. Bills were introduced, hearings were held, but the railroads had powerful lobbyists, and more importantly, they had facts on the ground. The system worked. Challenging it would create chaos. And so Congress did what Congress often does with difficult problems: nothing at all. By 1918, people who remembered the day of 2 noons were elderly or dead. The younger generation knew nothing else. To them, Central Standard Time wasn't an imposition. It was just time. The railroads had won. Not through law, not through democracy, through infrastructure, through the fact that if you controlled the rails, you controlled America. Time, which had been natural, became artificial. Time, which had been local, became national. Time, which had been democratic, each community reading the sun for themselves, became imposed from above by men who cared about train schedules, not your relationship with the sky. For all of human history, until 1883, time was something you discovered. You looked at the sun. You watched the shadows. Time was a dialogue between you and the cosmos. After 1883, time was something you were told. Time came through a telegraph wire. Time was standardized regardless of what the sun was doing. Time was no longer nature speaking to you. It was bureaucracy speaking for nature. When you look at your phone and see 12 o'clock, you're not seeing solar noon. You're probably 20 or 30 minutes away from the moment the sun actually peaks overhead. You're seeing a coordinate in an artificial grid that William Allen drew in 1881. Your time zone is a corporate product. The lines that divide Eastern from Central were drawn for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Not for you? Consider what changed. Before Standard Time, telegraph operators had to note what time standard each message used. Messages could arrive before they were sent, according to local clocks. Standard Time swept that away. The telegraph became vastly more efficient. Efficiency bred dependency. Stock prices transmitted in real time. News spread within hours. Business decisions that once took weeks could be made in minutes. Standard Time accelerated American life. Before Standard Time, factory shifts were local matters. Standard Time made synchronized national production possible. A factory in Pittsburgh could coordinate with a factory in Chicago. But workers lost flexibility. Your shift started at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Didn't matter if the sun was up. Didn't matter what your body said. The time clock was a statement that natural rhythms didn't matter. Only the standard mattered. Before Standard Time, geography determined your time. Every place had its own moment. Standard Time erased those distinctions. If you lived in the western half of a zone, you shared a clock with people hundreds of miles east who experienced solar noon at a completely different moment. Modern studies show people on the western edge of time zones get less sleep than people on the eastern edge. Social rhythms follow the clock, but bodies follow the sun. You might be experiencing this now. If the morning alarm comes impossibly hard, check where you live within your time zone. You might be living on borrowed time. If you've made it this far, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The question of who gets to decide. In 1882, most Americans would have said the town determines its own time. The mayor, the church, the local jeweler. Time was local business. In 1884, the answer had changed. The railroads determined time. Executives who'd never visited your town, who cared only about stations and freight. This was a transfer of power through infrastructure capture. The railroads controlled essential infrastructure. Whoever controls essential infrastructure makes the rules. And by 1883, everyone depended on the railroads. And Congress could have fought? They didn't. The economic consequences were too severe. Detroit held out 17 years. They got isolation and confusion. Eventually, they gave in. Not because they agreed, because they had no choice. This is what Standard Time teaches. Formal authority matters less than infrastructure control. Whoever controls essential systems sets the rules. The time zones on your phone are corporate products. Congress didn't endorse them until 35 years after the railroads implemented them. Let me close with what was lost. Local time wasn't just a different system. It was a different relationship with the world. For all of human history before 1883, your time was your place's time. When you stood in your town at solar noon, you were experiencing something that only people in your exact longitude could share at that exact moment. Your noon was unique. Your noon was yours. The church bells that rang at noon in your town were ringing for your community, synchronized to your sky, marking a moment that belonged to your place and no other place on earth. Time that came from the ground up, time you discovered when you looked at the sky, time that connected you to your specific place on earth, to the angle of sunlight on your town, to the rotation of the planet beneath your feet. There's something profound about solar time. It reminds you that you're standing on a spinning rock. It connects you to astronomy, to physics, to the geometry of the cosmos. When you knew your local noon, you knew something about where you were in the universe. Standard Time replaced that cosmic awareness with a grid someone drew on a map. Your time zone doesn't tell you anything about your relationship with the sun. It tells you which administrative region you've been assigned to. Local time bound you to place. Your time was your place's time. Standard Time severed that connection, replaced local, discovered time with national, imposed time. We gained something: the modern economy, national coordination, the ability to run trains without killing passengers. But we lost the feeling that time was ours, that it belonged to our communities, our traditions, our relationship with the sun. We surrendered that to the railroads, not through choice, but through infrastructure dependency. We got time back only as zones someone else drew. Lines that run where they run because it made sense for freight scheduling in 1883. Every time you look at a clock, you're looking at a compromise, a surrender that happened in 1883, when the railroads told America what time it was. The clocks still lie. They show noon that may be 30 minutes from actual solar noon. But you've forgotten it's a lie. The railroads made sure of that. They gave us standard time and took our relationship with the sun. Congress didn't approve it until 1918. That's the story behind every clock in America. That's the day of two noons. Next time someone asks what time it is, pause. You're telling them what the Pennsylvania Railroad decided in 1883. Nobody asked you. Nobody asked any of us. This channel exists for these stories. Histories hiding in plain sight, in the clocks on your walls, the lines on your maps, the assumptions you make every day. Subscribe if you want more. I'll see you in the next one.